The gunshot echoed across the valley like the crack of doom as Margaret Anderson watched her husband Thomas slump from his horse, blood blooming across his chest. That morning in May of 1878, she became a widow with 6 children to feed on the unforgiving edge of Randsburg, California, a mining town that cared little for a woman's tears. "Thomas!" Margaret screamed, dropping the basket of laundry she'd been hanging. Her eldest son, William, just 12, was already running toward his father's fallen form. The other children watched from the porch, frozen in horror as their mother's cries split the morning air. The doctor later explained that the stray bullet had come from a dispute between miners at the creek that bordered their property. "Wrong place, wrong time," he'd mumbled, packing away his useless instruments as Thomas's body cooled on their kitchen table. Margaret stood dry-eyed by the window, her auburn hair escaping its practical bun, watching her children's tear-streaked faces. William, sturdy for his age, 10-year-old Emma with her father's dark eyes, 8-year-old twins Sarah and Samuel, Elizabeth who had just turned 6, and little James, barely 4, who wouldn't stop asking when Papa was coming back. "What will we do now, Mama?" William asked that night, trying to sound like the man he wasn't yet. Margaret stroked his hair, her voice steadier than her heart. "We'll do what we must, Willie. We'll survive." But surviving meant facing the brutal truth. Their small ranch at the edge of Randsburg was mortgaged to the bank. The cattle needed tending, the fences were broken in 3 places, and winter wasn't far off. Thomas had been a good husband but a poor planner, leaving them with more dreams than dollars. 3 days after they buried Thomas, the banker came calling. "Mighty sorry about your loss, Mrs. Anderson," Harold Jenkins said, twisting his hat in his hands but not quite meeting her eyes. "But business is business, and that loan needs payments." "I'll get the money, Mr. Jenkins," Margaret replied, standing straight-backed in her hastily dyed black dress, not inviting him past the porch. "Give me until the end of summer." Jenkins frowned. "That's generous, madam. Most widows sell up and move back east." "This is our home," she said simply. "We're not leaving," but brave words couldn't fix broken fences or tend cattle. After a week of struggling alone, Margaret found Emma and William trying to repair the north pasture fence, their small hands bloodied from the effort. "The cows keep getting out, Mama," Emma explained, wiping sweat from her brow. "Mr. Patterson said he'd shoot any that wandered onto his property." That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, calculating what little money they had against what they needed. The numbers wouldn't balance no matter how she figured them. With 6 growing children and a ranch to maintain, they needed a miracle or at least an extra pair of strong hands. The answer arrived the next morning in the form of a tall stranger riding a dappled gray horse. "Madam," he called from the gate, keeping a respectful distance. "Name's Henry Drake. I heard in town you might be looking for help." Margaret shaded her eyes against the morning sun, taking his measure. He sat easy in the saddle, a lean man of perhaps 30 with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, his manner direct but not threatening. "Who told you that?" she asked, wary of charity and the strings that often came attached. "Blacksmith mentioned your husband passed, said you had young ones and a spread to manage." He removed his hat, revealing sandy brown hair. "I'm looking for honest work, madam, nothing more." Margaret hesitated. A single woman hiring a strange man invited gossip, but her children needed to eat more than she needed the town's approval. "Can you mend fences, Mr. Drake?" "Yes, madam." "And tend cattle, break horses, and grow just about anything that takes root in this soil." "I can offer room and board plus $5 a month. It's not much, it's fair," he interrupted. I don't need much, Mrs. Anderson. She showed him to the small cabin Thomas had built for storage, now hastily cleared to serve as quarters. The children and I are in the main house. We start work at dawn. Henry nodded, sizing up the neglected ranch. I'll start with that north fence. Looks like you're losing cattle through there. As he walked away, Margaret noticed little James trailing after the tall stranger, curious as only a 4-year-old could be. Mr. Drake talks like Papa, he informed her seriously when she called him back. But his hat's bigger. That first week, Henry kept to himself, working from sunup to sundown. He mended the broken fences with methodical care, using what materials were available and improvising where they weren't. He spoke little, answering the children's curious questions with patient brevity, and taking his meals on the porch to maintain propriety. By the second week, William had appointed himself Henry's shadow, watching the cowboy's every move and mimicking his stance. Margaret would find her eldest son practicing Henry's rope techniques in the yard, or trying to whittle wood scraps the way the cowboy did in the evenings. "Your boy's a quick study," Henry remarked one evening as Margaret brought him coffee. "Might make a fine rancher someday." "If we keep the ranch," she replied, the worry she hid from her children slipping into her voice. Henry studied her face in the fading light. "How bad is it?" Margaret hesitated, unused to sharing burdens. Thomas had always insisted financial matters weren't a woman's concern, leaving her in the dark about their true situation. "The bank loan comes due in August. We need to sell at least 15 head of cattle to make the payment, but with the fences down, we've already lost 5. She twisted her wedding ring, still strange on her finger without Thomas's steady presence beside her. "There's the matter of seed for winter wheat, and the roof leaks over the children's room." Henry nodded, absorbing the information without judgment. "The fences will be sound by week's end." "I noticed your south field has good grass coming in. We should move the herd there tomorrow. As for the roof," he glanced up at the darkening sky, "I can fix that too." Margaret felt something tight in her chest ease slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Drake." He looked at her then, really looked, and Margaret suddenly remembered she was still a young woman of 31, not just a mother and widow. "Henry," he corrected softly. "Just Henry is fine, Mrs. Anderson." "Then I'm Margaret," she replied, surprising herself. June brought scorching heat that baked the land and tested everyone's endurance. The children helped where they could, William with the stock, Emma and Sarah with the garden, Samuel carrying water, and even Elizabeth learning to collect eggs without breaking them. Little James mostly created mischief, following Henry like a devoted puppy and asking endless questions. One particularly hot afternoon, Margaret found Henry kneeling beside James near the tool shed, patiently showing him how to hammer a nail. "Gently now," he was saying, his large hand guiding the boy's small one. "The nail needs convincing, not threatening." James's face was scrunched in concentration, his tongue caught between his teeth exactly as Thomas's used to be when he was focused. The sight made Margaret's heart catch. "Mama, look," James called when he noticed her. "Henry says I'm the best nail hammerer in all California. Is that so?" She smiled, meeting Henry's eyes over her son's head. "Man needs to know how to build things," Henry said with a shrug, but there was something warm in his gaze that made Margaret look away. That evening, as Margaret tucked James into bed, he asked, "Is Henry staying forever, Mama?" "No, sweetheart. He's just helping us for a while." James considered this with 4-year-old gravity. "But we need him, and he likes us, I can tell." Margaret smoothed his hair. "It's not that simple, James. Why not? Papa's in heaven and Henry's here. He can be our new papa." "James," Margaret felt her cheeks flush, "Mr. Drake works for us." That's all. But lying awake that night, Margaret found her thoughts drifting to the quiet cowboy. There was something reliable about him that reminded her of solid ground after months of shifting sand. The way he spoke to her children with respect, not condescension. The way he worked alongside her, not for her. The way his eyes sometimes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. In July, the first real test of their fragile arrangement came when 3 men from the mining company rode onto the property, claiming rights to the water in the creek that fed Margaret's cattle. "This creek's always been common water," Margaret argued, standing her ground even as the mining foreman towered over her. "Company bought the rights last month, madam," the foreman said with practiced patience. "We'll be damming it upstream for our operations." "That will dry out our grazing land," Margaret protested. "My cattle ain't our concern, Mrs. Anderson," another miner cut in. "Maybe you should sell up before things get difficult." Henry appeared from the barn, his approach unhurried but purposeful. He positioned himself slightly in front of Margaret, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "there's a water rights document filed with the county clerk. The Anderson property has historical claim to this creek dating back to 1862. The foreman frowned. "And who might you be?" "Someone who checked the records," Henry replied. "You're welcome to do the same, but until then this water stays where it is." The miners exchanged glances, clearly not expecting resistance. "We'll be back," the foreman warned, but they mounted up and rode out. "Is there really a document?" Margaret asked when they were gone. Henry's expression remained neutral. "There will be by tomorrow. I'm riding into town to see the clerk." "How did you know they were coming?" "Heard talk in the saloon last time I was in town." "Mining company's been buying up water rights all over the county." He hesitated. "Margaret, they won't stop easily. They want this land. Then they'll have to fight for it," she said firmly, though fear coiled in her stomach. "This is my children's future." Henry studied her with something like admiration. "You're not what I expected, Margaret Anderson." "What did you expect?" A rare smile crossed his face. "Not someone who'd face down 3 armed men without flinching." The next day, Henry returned from town with a properly filed water rights document that predated the mining company's claim. He didn't explain how he'd managed it, and Margaret didn't ask. But that night, she added extra biscuits to his dinner plate, their fingers brushing as she passed him the basket. "The children want to celebrate Pioneer Day next week," she said, changing the subject from the weight of gratitude she couldn't express. "There's to be a dance in town." Henry nodded, sopping up gravy with his biscuit. "Will you go?" "I hadn't thought to. With Thomas gone less than 3 months." "A day in town might do the young ones good," he suggested. "And you too." Margaret considered. She'd been so focused on survival that moments of joy seemed almost traitorous, but the children deserved some normality, some connection to the community beyond their isolated ranch. "Perhaps we will," she conceded. "Would you join us?" Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure. "If you'd like." The Pioneer Day celebration transformed Randsburg's dusty Main Street into a festival of bunting and banners. There was a shooting contest, pie judging, 3-legged races for the children, and a band setting up for dancing later. Margaret wore her second-best dress, the best still being the black one she'd worn to bury Thomas, and pinned her hair up with special care. The children ran ahead, excited by the noise and color after months of quiet grief. Even William abandoned his newly adopted solemnity to join a group of boys his age in a game of horseshoes. Only James stayed close, holding Henry's hand as naturally as if he'd been doing it all his life. "Look at all the flags, Henry," the boy exclaimed, pointing at the patriotic decorations with his free hand. "Fine-looking flags," Henry agreed, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled down at James. Margaret watched them together, this tall, weathered man and her smallest son, and felt something shift inside her, a recognition of what her family was becoming, whether she'd planned it or not. They spent the day moving between activities, the older children drifting back to report their adventures before racing off again. Henry won the shooting contest, much to William's vocal admiration, and donated the prize money to the school fund without ceremony. Margaret's apple pie earned second place, beaten only by the formidable Mrs. Templeton, who had won for 15 consecutive years. As dusk approached, lanterns were lit and the band struck up a lively tune. Couples began to gather for dancing. "Mama, aren't you going to dance?" Emma asked, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Margaret shook her head. "I'm content to watch, dear. But you love dancing. You and Papa used to dance in the kitchen." Emma's innocent observation cut straight to Margaret's heart, memories of Thomas spinning her around their kitchen flooding back. Before she could respond, Henry appeared at her side. He had removed his hat and smoothed his hair, and there was a question in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. "Would you honor me with a dance, Margaret?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, aware of curious glances from townspeople nearby. What would they think the widow Anderson dancing with her hired hand, barely 3 months after burying her husband? But then she looked at Henry, really looked at him, and realized she cared less about their opinions than she'd thought. This man had rebuilt her fences, protected her water rights, treated her children with kindness, and never once made her feel less capable because she was a woman alone. "Yes," she said simply, and placed her hand in his. Henry led her onto the makeshift dance floor with surprising grace for a man who spent his days on horseback. His hand at her waist was respectful, his movements measured as they joined the flow of dancers circling the square. "I haven't danced since before James was born," she admitted, concentrating on the steps. "You dance beautifully," he replied, and the sincerity in his voice made her look up. In that moment, as their eyes met and held, Margaret felt the first stirring of something she'd thought died with Thomas' possibility. Not just the possibility of survival, which Henry had already helped ensure, but the possibility of happiness, of connection. The music shifted to a slower waltz. Henry's hand tightened slightly at her waist, drawing her a fraction closer. "Is this all right?" he asked, his voice low. Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They moved together through the golden lantern light, and for those few minutes, the weight of widowhood and worry lifted from her shoulders. From the edge of the dance floor, her children watched with varying reactions, William with suspicious assessment, Emma with romantic sighs, the twins with giggles, Elizabeth with sleepy acceptance, and James with complete approval. As the dance ended, Henry reluctantly released her. "Thank you," he said formally, but his eyes communicated something deeper. "I should check on the children," Margaret murmured, suddenly overwhelmed by emotions she wasn't ready to name. They gathered their brood and headed home under a canopy of stars, the wagon quieter on the return journey as tired children dozed against each other. James fell asleep in Henry's arms, his small head tucked trustingly against the cowboy's shoulder. Margaret, driving the team, stole glances at the man beside her cradling her youngest. In the moonlight, his profile was strong and sure, but there was gentleness in the way he held her son, in how carefully he placed his feet when they reached home so as not to wake the sleeping child. After the children were tucked into bed, Margaret found Henry on the porch, smoking a rare cigarette as he gazed at the night sky. "Thank you for today," she said, wrapping her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "The children needed that." Henry nodded, extinguishing his cigarette respectfully. "They're good kids, Margaret. You've raised them well." Thomas and I, she corrected automatically, then paused. Though I suppose it's just me now. Not just you, Henry said quietly. Not anymore. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Henry, Margaret began, then faltered. I don't know what, you don't need to know yet, he interrupted gently. Some things take time. Relief mingled with something like disappointment in Margaret's chest. Yes, she agreed. Time. August brought the cattle sale, with Henry and William driving 15 head to the larger market in Bakersfield rather than accepting the lower prices offered locally. They returned with enough money to pay the bank loan with a small margin to spare. Mr. Jenkins wasn't expecting full payment, Margaret told Henry that evening as they sat on the porch, the day's heat finally giving way to a cooler breeze. I think he wanted the excuse to foreclose. Man like that profits from other people's hardships, Henry observed, whittling a small wooden horse that was taking shape under his skilled hands. But you proved him wrong. We proved him wrong, she corrected. I couldn't have done this without you, Henry. He looked up from his carving, his blue eyes serious in the lamplight. Yes, you could have. Maybe not as quickly or easily, but you're stronger than you know, Margaret. His faith in her stirred something warm in her chest. For so long, she'd been fighting to prove to the town, to herself, that she could manage alone. Henry was the first person who seemed to simply assume her capability, neither surprised by her strength nor threatened by it. The children start school next month, she said, changing the subject to safer ground. All except James, of course. He's still too young. Henry nodded, returning to his carving. William's gotten good with the cattle. Boy has a natural feel for it. Yes, he reminds me of his father sometimes. Margaret twisted her wedding ring, a habit she'd developed since Thomas's death. Thomas had dreams of building this place into something substantial. He just never had the chance to see it through. What are your dreams, Margaret? Henry asked unexpectedly. The question caught her off guard. No one had asked about her dreams in so long, she'd almost forgotten she was allowed to have them. Security, she answered after a moment. Knowing my children will never go hungry or lose their home, seeing them grow up happy and well. She hesitated. And perhaps someday, not to be quite so alone. Henry's hand stilled on his carving. You're not alone now. No, she acknowledged softly. I suppose I'm not. The wooden horse took shape beneath his knife, a perfect miniature steed with flowing mane and alert ears. When it was finished, Henry handed it to her without ceremony. For James, he said, though I expect I'll need to make 5 more to keep the peace. Margaret smiled, running her finger over the smooth wooden back. You're good to them, better than they had any right to expect from a stranger. Not a stranger anymore, am I? Henry's voice was quiet but certain. No, she agreed. Not a stranger at all. That night, Margaret placed the wooden horse on James's windowsill where he would find it in the morning. As she tucked the blanket around her sleeping son, she found herself wondering what it might be like to have Henry Drake as a permanent part of their lives, not as a hired hand, but as something more. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. September brought cooler weather and the routine of school days. The ranch settled into a new rhythm, with the older children leaving each morning for the one-room schoolhouse in town and returning with stories and assignments each afternoon. Margaret used the quieter days to put up preserves for winter, with only James underfoot, helping in his enthusiastic 4-year-old way. Henry continued his steady improvements to the ranch, reinforcing the barn roof before winter storms, digging a new well closer to the house, expanding the chicken coop. Each project was completed with thoughtful care, as if he were building for the long term rather than just seasonal employment. One afternoon, Margaret found him laying out lumber in the north pasture, measuring and marking with focused attention. "What are you building?" she asked, shading her eyes against the autumn sun. Henry straightened, pushing his hat back. "A proper fence." "Those temporary repairs I made won't hold through winter," Margaret frowned. "I can't afford new lumber for the entire north pasture." "Already paid for," Henry said simply. "Got a good price from Miller's Mill." "Henry, I can't let you consider it an investment," he interrupted. "Good fences mean healthy cattle. Healthy cattle mean profit next spring." Margaret studied him, trying to understand his motivation. "Why are you doing all this? Surely you could find better paying work elsewhere." Henry was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. "Been riding from place to place most of my life," he finally said. "Working ranches from Texas to Montana, never stayed anywhere long enough to see a crop I planted get harvested." He looked at her directly then. "It feels good to build something that lasts, Margaret." There was more in his words than he was saying, she knew. More in his steady gaze that made her heart beat faster. "Then I'm glad you're here to build it," she replied softly. Over the next weeks, Henry worked on the fence whenever other chores allowed. William helped after school and on weekends, learning to set posts and stretch wire under Henry's patient instruction. Even the other children participated, with Emma and Sarah painting the crossbeams, Samuel carrying tools, Elizabeth sorting nails, and James supervising from atop an upturned bucket. It became a family project, though Margaret caught herself on that thought. Henry wasn't family, technically. Yet watching him with her children, seeing how naturally they turned to him with questions or for approval, how William had begun standing with the same slight angle to his shoulders, how James now insisted on wearing his hat tipped back, like Henry does. The lines had blurred beyond recognition. The fence took shape, sturdy, carefully constructed with a gate wide enough for cattle and wagons. Henry carved the family name into the top beam of the gate, Anderson, the letters deep and permanent. "It's beautiful," Margaret said when it was finished, standing beside him as they admired the work. "I've never seen such fine craftsmanship in a fence." Henry smiled, that rare, transformative expression that always caught her by surprise. "A fence does more than keep cattle in," he observed. "It defines what's yours, what you're protecting." Margaret felt the weight of his words, the layers of meaning. "Yes," she agreed, "it does." That evening, a sudden autumn storm blew in from the mountains. The children huddled by the fire as rain lashed the windows and thunder shook the small house. Margaret was checking for leaks in the roof Henry had recently repaired when a particularly violent thunderclap sent James running to her in tears. "I'm scared, Mama," he sobbed, wrapping his arms around her legs. "There's nothing to fear, sweetheart," she soothed, lifting him onto her hip, though he was getting almost too big for such treatment. "We're safe and dry inside." A pounding at the door startled them both. Margaret set James down and hurried to answer it, finding Henry on the porch, rain streaming from his hat and slicker. "Barn roof's holding, but that new calf and its mother needed moving to the dry stall," he reported, remaining outside despite the downpour. "Thought you'd want to know." "Come inside, Henry," Margaret insisted. "You're soaked through." He hesitated, glancing at the stormy darkness. "Better get back to my cabin. Don't be foolish. You'll catch your death." She opened the door wider. "The children would feel better with you here anyway." That decided him, as she'd known it would. Henry stepped inside, removing his dripping hat and slicker in the small entryway. James immediately attached himself to the cowboy's legs, earlier fears forgotten. "Are the animals scared too, Henry?" he asked earnestly. Henry crouched to the boy's level, his voice serious. "Some might be, but that's why we built them good, strong shelters. Same reason your mama keeps you safe in here." The other children gathered around, their earlier apprehension about the storm redirected to curiosity about the ranch animals. Henry patiently answered their questions. Accepting the dry clothes, Margaret brought him Thomas's old flannel shirt and trousers, never worn but kept in a chest with quiet thanks. When he emerged from the back room in the borrowed clothes, Margaret felt a strange doubling of time, as if Thomas and Henry briefly occupied the same space, past and present overlapping. But then Henry moved, his walk and manner entirely his own, and the moment passed. The storm intensified, rain drumming on the roof and wind howling around the corners of the house. Another boom of thunder rattled the windows, and Elizabeth squealed in fright. "How about a story?" Henry suggested, settling into the rocking chair by the fire. "Might take our minds off the storm." The children quickly arranged themselves at his feet, even William forgetting to maintain his grown-up distance. Margaret brought Henry a cup of coffee, then took her own seat with her mending basket, grateful for his calming presence. Henry's voice, usually used sparingly, revealed a surprising gift for storytelling. He told tales of cattle drives and frontier towns, of wild horses and ancient Indian legends, adjusting the details to suit his young audience but never speaking down to them. The children listened, enraptured, fears forgotten as the storm raged outside their snug home. Margaret found herself equally captivated, not just by the stories, but by the man telling them. In the firelight, his features were softer, the lines around his eyes crinkling when he smiled at the children's reactions. He was handsome, she realized with a start. Not in the conventional way Thomas had been, with his regular features and easy charm, but in a weathered, substantial way that spoke of character rather than mere appearance. When the younger children began to yawn, Margaret rose. "Bedtime, I think. The storm's moving past now." There were token protests, but the excitement of the evening had tired them. Margaret herded them through their nightly routines, tucking each one in with a kiss. When she returned to the main room, she found Henry standing by the window, watching the rain subside. "Thank you for staying," she said. "The children feel safe with you here." He turned, his expression thoughtful. "And you, Margaret, do you feel safe?" The question carried weight beyond the simple words. Margaret considered her answer carefully. "Yes," she said finally, "I do." Henry nodded, understanding what she wasn't quite saying. "I should go. My cabin will be wet but standing." "You could stay," Margaret offered before she could reconsider. "On the settle here. The storm might come back." Their eyes met in the low lamplight, both aware of the line they were approaching. "That wouldn't be proper," Henry said quietly. "And you've rebuilt your life too carefully to risk gossip now." Margaret felt both disappointed and relieved at his restraint. "You're right, of course. But thank you for tonight." He put on his still damp hat and slicker, pausing at the door. "Sleep well, Margaret. You too, Henry." After he'd gone, Margaret stood for a long time by the window, watching the path to his cabin until the lamp flared briefly in its window, confirming he'd arrived safely. Only then did she bank the fire and retire to her own bed, her thoughts unsettled in ways that had nothing to do with the storm. October brought harvest time and a flurry of activity as the last crops were gathered and stored for winter. The fence was completed, enclosing the north pasture securely. Henry had carved a small design into each gate post, an intricate pattern that Margaret recognized from the wooden horse he'd made for James. "It's your mark, isn't it?" she asked one evening as they walked the fence line, checking for any issues before winter set in. "I've seen it on other things you've made," Henry nodded, looking almost embarrassed. "Old habit. My father was a carpenter before he took to ranching, taught me to sign my work." "I like that it's here," Margaret said. "That something of you will remain on this land." He gave her a searching look. "Planning to send me on my way, Margaret?" "No," she answered quickly, too quickly perhaps. "I only meant, nothing lasts forever. Eventually, you'll want to move on." Henry stopped walking, turning to face her directly. The setting sun cast long shadows across the pasture, gilding his features with warm light. "What if I don't want to move on?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "What if I want to stay?" Margaret's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead. "Stay as what, Henry? My hired hand forever?" "No." He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "Not as your hired hand." The implication hung in the air between them, impossible to misinterpret. Margaret felt herself trembling slightly, not from fear but from the enormity of what was being offered and what accepting would mean. "Henry, she began, but was interrupted by William's voice calling from the house. "Mama, Henry, supper's ready." The moment broke, reality rushing back in. Henry stepped away, giving her space. "We should head back," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Getting dark." Margaret nodded, grateful for the reprieve yet frustrated by the interruption. "Yes, we should." They walked back to the house in silence, each lost in thoughts of what had almost been said. The following Sunday, Margaret took the children to church as usual. Henry, who normally stayed behind to watch the property, surprised her by appearing at breakfast in his best shirt, freshly shaved. "Thought I might join you today," he said, helping James with his stubborn shoe buttons. "If that's all right." "Of course," Margaret replied, trying not to show how much his decision pleased her. "Everyone's welcome at church." The family rode to town together in the wagon, attracting curious glances as they took their usual pew with Henry at the end beside William. Reverend Foster's sermon was on Ruth's loyalty to Naomi, on finding family in unexpected places, and Margaret couldn't help feeling the words were somehow meant for her. After the service, as the congregation mingled outside, several townspeople made a point of greeting them. "Mrs. Anderson, your children are growing like weeds," Mrs. Templeton observed, her sharp eyes assessing Henry, who was helping Elizabeth untangle a ribbon from her hair. "And I see you've kept on that hired man." "Mr. Drake has been invaluable," Margaret replied evenly, recognizing the curiosity disguised as concern. "We've been blessed to have his help." "Indeed," Mrs. Templeton said, her tone suggesting anything but agreement. "Though people do talk, my dear." A young widow, alone with an unmarried man on her property. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "Mr. Drake lives in the old storage cabin, Mrs. Templeton. There's nothing improper in our arrangement." The older woman raised an eyebrow. "If you say so, dear. Though if you're planning to keep him on, you might consider a more permanent solution to protect your reputation." Before Margaret could respond, Henry appeared at her side, James perched on his shoulders. "Ready to head home?" he asked, seemingly oblivious to Mrs. Templeton's speculative gaze. "Yes," Margaret said with relief. "Good day, Mrs. Templeton." As they drove home, Margaret remained unusually quiet, turning the conversation over in her mind. She'd been so focused on survival that she hadn't fully considered how their situation appeared to others, or how it might affect her children's standing in the community. Henry noticed her preoccupation. "Something wrong. Just thinking," she replied, not ready to share Mrs. Templeton's insinuations. But that evening, after the children were asleep, Margaret found Henry on the porch and decided to broach the subject. "People are talking about us," she said without preamble. Henry didn't seem surprised. "People always talk. Question is, does it matter to you?" Margaret sighed, leaning against the porch railing. "It matters for the children. I don't want them facing whispers or unkindness because of choices I've made." "What choice is that, Margaret?" Henry asked quietly. keeping a hired man to help with work no woman should have to do alone. You know it's more than that now, she said, finally acknowledging what had been growing between them for months. At least, for me it is. Henry moved closer, his expression intent. It's more for me too, has been almost from the start. Margaret felt her heart race at his admission. I never expected to feel this way again. After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over. And now, she looked up at him, allowing herself to be honest. Now I find myself thinking about a future that includes more than just survival. That includes happiness and you. Henry reached out, taking her hand in his. His palm was calloused from work, but his touch was gentle. I love you, Margaret Anderson. Have for months now. Love your children too, like they were my own. He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. I'm not asking to replace Thomas. Man deserves to be remembered by his family. But I'm asking for a chance to build something alongside those memories. Something new. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, not from sadness but from a surge of emotion so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. The children need a father, she whispered. And I've been so lonely, Henry. Even surrounded by them, I've been lonely. You don't have to be lonely anymore, he promised. Not if you don't want to be. Are you asking me to marry you, Henry Drake? Margaret's voice was steady despite her tears. Yes, madam, I believe I am. His smile was tender, transforming his weathered face. Though I don't have much to offer except 2 strong hands and a heart that's yours completely. Margaret stepped closer, resting her hand against his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and sure beneath her palm. That's more than enough, she said, and lifted her face to his. Their first kiss was gentle, almost hesitant, a new beginning, tentative but full of promise. When they parted, Henry touched her cheek with reverent fingers. You're sure? He asked. This isn't gratitude or convenience. Margaret shook her head. It's love, Henry. I think perhaps it has been for longer than I was ready to admit. His smile then was like sunrise after the longest night, brilliant and full of hope. Then, I'm the luckiest man in California, Margaret Anderson. The next morning, Margaret gathered her children in the kitchen before Henry arrived for breakfast. They sat around the table, curious about this unusual family meeting. I have something important to ask you all, she began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. You know that Henry has been helping us run the ranch. 6 heads nodded in unison. And you know that he's become a friend to our family. More nods, though Williams was slower, his expression watchful. Margaret took a deep breath. Henry has asked me to marry him. Before I give him my answer, I wanted to know how you children feel about it. There was a moment of stunned silence, then a babble of reactions. James bounced in his seat with excitement. Elizabeth clapped her hands. The twins exchanged meaningful looks. Emma's eyes widened, then filled with tears that seemed both happy and sad. William alone remained silent, his young face troubled. Would Henry be our new papa? James asked, his 4-year-old mind going straight to the practical question. He would be your stepfather, Margaret explained carefully. No one can ever replace your real father, and Henry doesn't want to try. But he cares for all of you very much and wants to help me take care of you and the ranch. I think it's wonderful, Emma declared, wiping her eyes. Henry is kind and he makes you smile, Mama. You didn't smile for a long time after Papa died. Sarah and Samuel nodded in agreement. He taught me to ride proper, Samuel offered, and he never gets angry when we ask questions. He makes the best wooden animals, Elizabeth added, her 7-year-old priorities clear. Margaret turned to her eldest. William, what do you think, son? William looked down at his hands, then up at his mother with eyes so like Thomas's that it made her heart ache. Papa would want you to be happy, he said finally, and the ranch needs a man to run it proper. He straightened his shoulders. I think it's all right, Mama. Relief washed through Margaret. "Thank you, William. That means a great deal to me." When Henry arrived for breakfast, 6 pairs of eyes watched him with new awareness. James, unable to contain himself, blurted out the news before Henry had even taken his seat. "Mama says you want to marry her and be our new pa. Is that true, Henry?" Henry's gaze flew to Margaret's face, a question in his eyes. She nodded, smiling. "It's true," he confirmed, addressing himself to all the children but particularly to William. "If your mother and all of you are agreeable, I'd be honored to join your family." "We already decided," James announced importantly. "You can marry Mama." Henry's face broke into a rare, full smile. "Well, that's mighty kind of you, James. What about the rest of you?" One by one, the children gave their approval, William last of all with a solemn nod that Henry returned with equal seriousness. "Then," Henry said, turning to Margaret, "it seems I have permission to court your mother properly." And court her he did, though in practical ways that suited their circumstances. He brought her wildflowers gathered from the high pasture. He carved a rocking chair that fit her perfectly. He taught William more advanced riding skills, showing respect for the boy's position as oldest son. He listened to Emma's recitations from school with genuine interest, helped the twins with their chores before they asked, patiently answered Elizabeth's endless questions, and let James help with his projects despite the extra time it took. Most importantly, he treated Margaret not as a helpless widow to be rescued, but as a capable partner whose opinion he valued and whose strength he admired. They were married by Reverend Foster on Thanksgiving Day, with the entire town in attendance. The mining company had moved its operations further north, the bank was satisfied with their loan payments, and the ranch was secure for another season. There was much to be thankful for. Margaret wore a new dress of deep blue that Henry said matched her eyes. The children stood proudly beside them, William serving as best man, Emma as maid of honor, the twins and Elizabeth scattering late autumn flowers, and James carrying the rings on a small pillow with exaggerated care. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Henry kissed her with restrained tenderness, mindful of their audience. But his eyes promised more for later, when they were alone. The town turned out for the celebration afterward, curiosity as much as goodwill bringing them to the church hall, where tables groaned with food contributed by neighbors. Mrs. Templeton's approval hard won through Henry's regular church attendance, and respectful courting had swayed public opinion decidedly in their favor. "Mrs. Drake," Henry murmured as they shared the first dance, his hand warm at her waist. "How does it sound?" "Wonderful," Margaret replied, her heart full to bursting. "Though the children will keep Anderson, I think, to honor their father," Henry nodded, understanding as always. "As they should. We'll make our own traditions alongside the old ones." Later, as the celebration continued around them, Margaret found a moment alone with William. Her eldest son had been quiet throughout the day, polite but reserved. "Are you truly all right with this, Willie?" she asked gently, using the childhood name he'd recently outgrown. William considered the question with the seriousness that had always been his nature, even before his father's death had thrust adult responsibilities upon him. "Henry's a good man," he said finally. "He doesn't try to make me forget Papa. And—" He hesitated, looking across the room where Henry was showing James how to properly bow to a lady, the little boy's face scrunched in concentration. "He makes us feel safe, Mama, like a family again." Margaret blinked back tears, touched by her son's insight. "Yes," she agreed. "That's exactly what he does." That night, after the celebration and after the children were settled, with Emma in charge of the younger ones in the main house, while the newlyweds spent their first night in Henry's improved cabin. Margaret and Henry began their married life together. "I never thought I'd have this again," Margaret confessed as they lay together in the quiet darkness. "A partnership, someone to share the burdens and the joys." Henry's arms tightened around her. "I never thought I'd have it at all," he admitted. "Always figured I'd die a solitary old cowhand somewhere. Then I rode onto your land and found 6 children and the strongest woman I'd ever met." Margaret smiled against his chest. "I wasn't strong. I was terrified." "Being scared doesn't mean you're not strong," Henry said, his hand stroking her hair. "Means you're facing something that matters." They talked long into the night, sharing histories and hopes in a way their courtship hadn't allowed. Henry spoke of his wandering years, of the skills he'd gathered working ranches across the West. Margaret told him of her early marriage to Thomas, of the dreams they'd had for their growing family and the land they'd claimed. "I want to build something that lasts," Henry said as dawn approached. "Something our children and their children can point to and say, 'My family built that.'" "Our children," Margaret repeated, savoring the words. "I like the sound of that." The winter of 1878–79 was one of the harshest in memory, with snowstorms that isolated Randsburg for weeks at a time. But inside the Anderson-Drake home, as the children had taken to calling it, there was warmth and plenty. Henry's preparations, the reinforced barn, the extra hay stored, the woodpile stacked high, saw them through the worst of the weather. The family settled into new routines. Henry moved from the cabin to the main house, adding a room for the boys so that he and Margaret could have privacy. Each night, he read aloud from one of the few books they owned. The children gathered around the fire, Margaret sewing or mending nearby. These quiet evenings, more than anything else, cemented their new reality as a family united. Spring came late but gloriously, the ranch emerging from winter's grip with renewed vigor. The cattle had weathered well, with minimal losses. The fence Henry had built stood strong against the winter drifts, exactly as he'd promised. On a warm April morning, as Henry and William repaired a wagon wheel and the other children helped Margaret plant the kitchen garden, James came running from the house, waving a piece of paper. "Henry, I drawed our family," he announced, proudly displaying his artwork. Henry wiped his hands on a rag and crouched to examine the childish drawing. "Well, look at that. That's mighty fine, James." The picture showed 7 stick figures of varying heights standing in front of what was recognizably their house. Above them, in wobbly letters, James had written "Our family" with Margaret's help. "That's you," James explained, pointing to the tallest figure. "And that's Mama. And that's Willie and Emma and Sarah and Sam and Lizzie and me." His small finger jabbed at each figure in turn. "And that's our fence," he added, indicating a line surrounding the entire drawing. "You built it to keep us safe." Henry's throat tightened with emotion. "That's right, son. That's what fences are for." James beamed at him. "And you're inside the fence with us now, forever and ever." "Yes," Henry agreed, his voice husky as he gathered the small boy into a hug. "Forever and ever." Margaret, who had approached in time to hear the exchange, felt her heart swell with love for this man who had rebuilt not just their fences but their sense of family. She joined them, placing her hand on Henry's shoulder. "James," she said, "why don't you take your drawing to show your brothers and sisters? I think they'll be very impressed." As James ran off, Henry stood and pulled Margaret into his arms. "That boy has a way of getting right to the heart of things," he said, his eyes suspiciously bright. "He does," Margaret agreed. "A fence is more than posts and rails. It's protection. It's belonging." She placed her hand on his cheek. "It's love." Henry kissed her then, not caring who might see. "I have something to tell you," he said when they parted. I filed the final paperwork yesterday. The north section is officially ours. Added to your original claim, we now have enough land to run twice the cattle. Margaret's eyes widened. Henry, that's wonderful. But how did you? Been saving since I started working for you, he explained. Figure it's a good investment in our future. In the legacy we'll leave our children, our children. The phrase still gave Margaret a warm glow. Speaking of children, she said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I have something to tell you two. Henry's brow furrowed. Everything all right? More than all right, Margaret assured him, taking his hand and placing it gently on her still flat stomach. We're going to have a baby, Henry, come November. Joy transformed his face, years dropping away as he lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace. A baby, our baby. He set her down hastily, suddenly concerned. Should you be out here working? Do you need to rest? Margaret laughed, delighted by his reaction. I'm perfectly fine. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, you know. I've already done it 6 times myself. But this is different, Henry insisted, his protective instincts fully engaged. This is our child. Yes, Margaret agreed, softening. Our child, the first of our making, though certainly not the first of our loving. They stood together in the spring sunshine, hands entwined over the new life growing within her. Surrounded by the ranch, they were building together a ranch enclosed by a fence that meant far more than its physical presence. A fence that defined and protected what was most precious. Family. I love you, Margaret Drake, Henry said, using her new name with deliberate emphasis. And I love you, she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him again. Thank you for building our fence and calling it family. In the years that followed, the Anderson-Drake Ranch prospered beyond their modest hopes. They added a son they named Joseph Henry in November of 1879, followed by twin daughters, Hope and Faith, in 1881. The fence Henry built lasted for decades, maintained first by his own hands, then by William's and eventually by Joseph's. But its greatest legacy wasn't in the sturdy posts or carefully stretched wire. It was in what it represented. The boundaries of love that enclosed and protected them all, a visible reminder of the family Henry Drake had found and fought for, the family he had built post by post and heart by heart on the edge of Randsburg, California, in the fading days of the American frontier.